Good morning, Backyard Kids. This month, we are taking things to the final frontier. We're getting ready to launch so that we can boldly do what needs to be done, and that takes initiative. Now remember, God always has had a special plan for His people. And even though the people promised to remain faithful to God and to follow His ways, they turned away from Him time after time. So God allowed enemy armies to take His people captive and to carry them off to the Babylonian Empire, which was really far away. Then, after about 70 years, some of God's people were allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple. But back in Babylon, the Jewish people had made lives for themselves. One Jewish man, who was named Nehemiah, had become pretty important. He was the cupbearer to the king, which meant that he had to check the king's beverage at any meal to make sure that he hadn't been poisoned. So the king had to really trust Nehemiah to give him a job that was so important to him. Now, even though it had been 150 years since God's people had left Jerusalem, and Nehemiah had actually never lived there, there was a big part of Nehemiah's heart that was still in his homeland. So one day, Nehemiah's brother and one of his friends came back from a trip to Jerusalem, so Nehemiah was able to get some news about the city and the people who were there. The two men told him that some of the people who had returned were still alive, but they were having a really hard time. The walls of Jerusalem had been broken down and the gates burned. This was horrible news. In those days, a city without walls wasn't safe. It meant they were open to attack at any time, and the people there would have no way of defending themselves. So after hearing this, Nehemiah sat down and cried. His heart was broken. He was so sad that he couldn't even eat for several days. Instead, he spent that time in prayer with God. He started by praising God and then asking God to give his prayers extra careful attention. He talked to God about how he knew that God's people were suffering, but how he also knew that they had not done what they had promised God that they would do. He then, though, reminded God of the promise that he had made, that if his people returned to him, that he would bring them back together again. And then Nehemiah asked God for help. See, as Nehemiah prayed, he decided that he needed to do something about this problem, that he needed help. So he decided to go to the king that he worked for. Nehemiah told the king what had happened to the walls and to the gates of Jerusalem. And then God gave Nehemiah the strength and the boldness to do something kind of crazy. He asked the king to let him off work so that he could go and help rebuild Jerusalem. He also then asked for letters to all the governors of the lands that he would pass getting there that would allow him safe passage. And then he asked for one more letter requesting logs from the keeper of the royal park so that they would have wood to build with once they got there in Jerusalem. I bet Nehemiah was holding his breath and sweating at this point, because you didn't just ask for the king for favors like that, and he just made 3 very bold requests. What would the king do? Would he fire Nehemiah for having the gumption to do that? But the king not only gave Nehemiah everything that he asked for, he also sent army officers and then horsemen to help guide him and keep them safe along the way. So when Nehemiah reached Jerusalem, he laid low for a bit. He set out to see for himself the damage to the walls and to the gates, and it was devastated. They would only be able to fix this with God's help and guidance. So the next morning, he called together all of the priests, the nobles, and officials, all the leaders in the city, and he gave them a pep talk, and he asked for their help in rebuilding the walls of the city. So he told these leaders everything that had happened so far and how God had blessed his path. And after hearing all of this, they couldn't argue. They knew that God was with Nehemiah and that he would be with them too. So they got to work. And when all the people in Jerusalem saw this, they got on board as well. Guys, nobody expected Nehemiah to show up and to take on the job of rebuilding the wall around the city. After all, he had a good life. He was working for the king in a great place. He had no complaints. But when he heard about this damage to what was he considered to be his homeland, Nehemiah knew that he couldn't wait for someone else to fix it. He decided that he needed to be part of the solution. And that's what initiative is all about, guys. It's seeing what needs to be done and then doing it, not waiting around for someone else to take care of it. Nehemiah took the initiative to help, and that's what you and I should do as well. In fact, that's our bottom line for this week. Don't wait for someone else to do what needs to be done. Remember, guys, for you, it's probably not rebuilding and repairing the walls or the gates of a city. But if you take a look around, I think you'll find plenty of ways that you can take initiative around you. So you can always go to God in prayer and ask for help in finding that.